On December 1st, 1879, the D'Oyly Carte Opera Company presented Gilbert and Sullivan's H.M.S. Pinafore at Ford's Fifth Avenue Theater in New York City, with the stage directed by Mr. W.S. Gilbert and the orchestra conducted by Mr. Arthur Sullivan. The fourth collaboration between playwright William S. Gilbert and composer Arthur S. Sullivan, H.M.S. Pinafore had opened at London's Opera Comique a year and a half earlier, in May 1878, and quickly became an international phenomenon. Sailing aboard the Cunard steamer Bothnia, Gilbert and Sullivan arrived in New York on November 5th to secure American copyright for their new operetta, The Pirates of Penzance. But they would also produce H.M.S. Pinafore. The arrival of the famous pair was trumpeted by local papers, the New York press hailing them as the builders and architects of H.M.S. Pinafore. The production of Pinafore at Ford's Fifth Avenue Theater would be the first authorized performance in America. The first unauthorized American production of H.M.S. Pinafore opened at the Boston Museum in November 1878, a full year before Gilbert and Sullivan's triumphal arrival in New York. A month later, the Alice Oates English Comic Opera Company presented Pinafore in San Francisco, again an unauthorized performance. And Pinafore spread quickly to Baltimore, Philadelphia, and New York. By February 1879, there were no fewer than 4 Pinafore companies playing in New York City. Not every critic was impressed, with some suggesting that a Pinafore quarantine be imposed, and predicting that
the entire fleet of pinafores will have foundered in the ocean of public esteem long before the violets bloom.
The naysayers were wrong. By the end of the 1879 theater season, every major theater in New York City had presented at least one production of H.M.S. Pinafore. On January 26th, Pinafore sailed into Chicago, with the Boston English Opera Company opening at Hooley's Theater. During the next 2 months, an armada of pinafores sailed the upper Midwest. And soon, no city of any size would escape the onslaught. In 1879, Rutherford B. Hayes was entering the 3rd year of his presidency. His tenure overshadowed by the long depression of 1873 to 1879. In this time of economic and political uncertainty, the tale of the simple sailor who falls in love with his captain's daughter, set to irresistibly hummable tunes, captured the public's imagination. The press took notice of this unqualified popularity, with Frank Leslie's Illustrated Weekly proclaiming,
"Certain it is that no English craft that ever visited our ports has received a warmer greeting. Bristling with wit and sparkling with melody, no wonder it has been a success."
Newspapers began counting the number of pinafore companies touring the country, the Cleveland Plain Dealer reporting on February 22nd that
there are now no less than 14 regularly organized professional companies playing pinafore in the United States.
This count was soon increased to 15 by an authority on musical matters, then to 29, then to 40, with one wag remarking,
"At present, there are 42 companies playing pinafore about the country. Companies formed after 6 p.m. yesterday are not included."
By May, the reported number of companies playing pinafore had increased to 150. Among these was Pauline Markham's pinafore troupe. Born in England in 1847, Pauline Markham came to America in 1868 with Lydia Thompson's British Blondes Company. By 1879, she was a well-established star of opera bouffe, an early form of burlesque with a saucy blend of music, comedy, clever social satire, and bold sexuality that piqued the interest of audiences across the country. About the time the original Boston Museum Pinafore production was closing its doors and going on tour, Pauline was completing a run of Chilperic at Boston's Howard Athenaeum. By mid-February, she had formed her own Pinafore company, arriving in Cincinnati on February 18th and staying at the Gibson House. While Pauline was traveling west from Boston, another female impresario, Alice Oates, was on her way east from San Francisco, where she had presented Pinafore in December 1878. Born in Nashville in 1849, Alice Oates was the founder, directress, and prima donna of the Oates English Comic Opera Company. Her obituary notes that both her own face and her stage face
were animated by a quick intelligence, and her voice was of a remarkably sympathetic tone. Her style of acting was vivacious in the extreme, and carried her audiences by storm from her own apparent enjoyment and fun.
She brought Pinafore to St. Louis's Olympic Theater on February 28th. Alice and Pauline crossed paths in Cincinnati less than a week later, when the Oates English Comic Opera Company presented Pinafore at the Grand Opera House, with Miss Oates herself portraying the lovesick sailor, Rafe Rackstraw. Indeed, when the Markham Pinafore troupe arrived in Cincinnati, no fewer than 3 other Pinafore companies had opened in the city: the Oates Company, John T. Ford's at Robinson's Opera House, and Bartley Campbell's opera troupe. Pauline Markham found herself a day late and $1 short. This would become a recurrent theme of her tour. With more business acumen and a larger repertoire than Pauline Markham, Alice Oates soon abandoned Pinafore and continued her Midwestern tour with other light operas, including Charles Lecoq's Le Petit Duc. Bartley Campbell's opera troupe was the same that first performed H.M.S. Pinafore at New York's Lyceum Theater in February. Now at Cincinnati's Hoyks Opera House, it featured the same New York cast, with the cross-dressing Antoinette Sanger as Rafe Rackstraw and Estelle Mortimer as Little Buttercup. From Cincinnati, Mr. Campbell took his troupe on tour of the former Confederacy, starting in Louisville, Kentucky. By 1879, Reconstruction had ended in the former Confederate states, and what would become known as the Jim Crow era was just beginning. The Campbell troupe arrived in Atlanta on March 13th, presenting Pinafore at De Gives Opera House. The former rebels embraced H.M.S. Pinafore with as much fervor as their northern cousins. The Campbell Company arrived in New Orleans on March 23rd, playing at Bidwell's Academy of Music. On March 27th, it was back in Georgia, playing Pinafore at the Springer Opera House in Columbus. On Friday, March 28th, they arrived in Augusta, Georgia, joining Sally Holman's Canadian Pinafore troupe, which had also embarked on a tour of the American South. April 3rd found the Campbell Company playing in Charleston, South Carolina. The Charleston News and Courier reported,
Mr. Frank Drew, the gentleman who plays the part of Sir Joseph Porter, is the brother-in-law of Mr. Maurice Barrymore.
He was, in fact, the uncle of Mr. Barrymore's wife, Georgiana Drew, making him the granduncle of Lionel and Ethel Barrymore, and the great-great-granduncle of American actress Drew Barrymore. The Campbell Troupe's Southern tour was so successful that it turned down an invitation to play Vicksburg. Meanwhile, Pauline Markham continued her tour of the upper Midwest, opening March 19th in Indianapolis at the Metropolitan Theater. As always, Pauline's timing was impeccable. She arrived a week after Indianapolis had hosted Dixon's Fifth Avenue Pinafore Company. Though meeting with critical success, the Markham Pinafore troupe played for only 1 week and did not make expenses. She next played in Elkhart, Indiana, where she was damned with faint praise.
A gentleman of our acquaintance says Pauline Markham's Pinafore Company is the second best on the road.
On March 30th, Pauline Markham brought her Pinafore troupe to Chicago. True to form, she arrived as the McVickers Pinafore was entering its second successful week. With middling reviews and poor attendance, poor Pauline closed in less than a week. She headed back to the hinterland, taking her troupe to Kalamazoo, Michigan, and several smaller Wisconsin cities. The Markham Company returned to Chicago on May 20th at Hooley's Theater. Financial woes again besieged her, Sir Joseph Porter suing the company for non-payment. Completing her second 1-week Chicago engagement, she sought greener pastures in San Francisco, which she imagined to be
about the only spot on this continent where the people have been free from pinafore so far.
Other Pinafore companies continued to play Chicago through the summer, including Duff's Fifth Avenue Company from New York. With Thomas Whiffen as Sir Joseph, his wife Blanche Galton as Little Buttercup, Alonzo Hatch as Rafe Rackstraw, and Mademoiselle Jarbeau as Cousin Hebe. In July, the Chicago Tribune reported that 162 Pinafore performances had been presented in Chicago, a report reprinted in Dwight's Journal of Music. The Pinafore plague continued, spreading like the measles. Did Gilbert and Sullivan profit from this plague of pinafores? No. As the Cleveland Plain Dealer observed,
That was a pretty serious joke on Gilbert and Sullivan, their failure to appreciate the money value of pinafore. Not thinking it of much account, they failed to protect themselves from piracy, and as a consequence are out of a cool $500,000.
only John T. Ford's Pinafore Company proved itself worthy of honor, paying Gilbert and Sullivan $500. To protect future productions, Richard Doyley Cart traveled to New York to arrange for an American premiere of The Pirates of Penzance and the first authorized production of H.M.S. Pinafore.
Because Messrs. Ford and Zimmerman sent $500 to Messrs. Gilbert and Sullivan as their share of the profits from production of Pinafore, the composers have offered them the opportunity of first producing the new opera.
Sullivan himself proclaimed, "All honor to Manager Ford." A mutant strain of the Pinafore virus soon appeared, children's or juvenile pinafores. This juvenile strain of the Pinafore virus proved just as infectious as the original. No region of the country escaped the contagion. Mark Twain attended one of these juvenile productions in Chicago in November 1879 and wrote about it to his wife, Livy.
I went to 3 theaters with a lot of newspaper men. I stayed but a few minutes at 2 of them, but I saw a whole act at the 3rd. It was the first act of Pinafore, admirably done by children, little children like ours. The characters were most excellently taken. It was a marvel to see it.
Samuel Clemens.
Not everyone was delighted with these children's performances. The Society for the Prevention of Cruelty to Children repeatedly citing them as instances of child abuse. The satirical magazine Puck suggested the absurdity of the SPCC position regarding juvenile pinafores, while everyday cruelty was considered acceptable. These juvenile productions were an American innovation, and D'Oyly Carte came to this party late, establishing his first children's pinafore company in December 1879, managed by Richard Barker, the stage manager of the original Opera Comique production in London. As in America, not everyone was pleased with this children's production. Lewis Carroll expressed his indignation and horror that
a bevy of sweet, innocent-looking girls sing with bright and happy looks the chorus, "He said, damn me, he said, damn me." I cannot find words to convey to the reader the pain I felt in seeing those dear children taught to utter such words to amuse ears grown callous to their ghastly meaning. How Mr. Gilbert could have stooped to write, or Sir Arthur Sullivan could have prostituted his noble art to set to music such vile trash, it passes my skill to understand. Charles Dodgson.
Juvenile pinafores were not the only American innovation. There were church choir pinafores, colored pinafores, and a Lilliputian pinafore company of little people. Perhaps with tongue-in-cheek, some editors even talked of an equestrian pinafore. Adolf Neuendorf, founder and manager of the Germania Theater in New York City, even produced a well-reviewed and well-received German pinafore.
The Germans of this city have taken as kindly to H.M.S. Pinafore as the English-speaking public. In order that they might fully appreciate all the subtle points of the Queen's Navee, Mr. Neuendorf had it done into choice German. The result has been delightful. Not only has the classical rendition of the music captured the hearts of stolid Teutons, but hundreds of Americans have witnessed the performance and come away delighted with the result.
Those hamlets too small or too remote to attract professional companies were not deprived. They mounted amateur productions. Vermont's St. Albans Daily Messenger provided a sort of recipe for amateur companies.
You must know that the pinafore fever has broken out all over the country, and any community that possesses even a shade of musical ability and a quartet of mixed voices is attacked, the first symptom being an order on Oliver Ditson and Company for a dozen or so copies of the operetta. Directly the town is canvassed for yachting suits for the crew of Her Majesty's ship Pinafore, and happy is the man who has a white shirt and a pair of sailor's breeches. Busy needles soon put together the dress for the sisters and cousins and aunts, and the Queen's Navee suffers in no way by comparison with these impromptu companies.
Oliver Ditson and Company advertised its pinafore music, words, and libretto in newspapers across the country, and was acknowledged by Sullivan for paying $500 from profits derived from these sales. Scribner produced an H.M.S. pinafore for amateurs, and other publishers also profited from the pinafore craze. A reaction against pinafore soon manifested itself.
There has been the regular pinafore and the church pinafore, the colored pinafore and the infant pinafore, but no one has yet produced a Chinese pinafore, an Indian pinafore, a pinafore performed wholly by persons over 70, or a pinafore of school teachers, of carpenters, of milliners, or of journalists. There are yet unexplored depths and heights for pinafore.
A correspondent wrote from the State Senate chamber in Albany.
Dear friend George, Albany is sorely afflicted. Got it the worst way. Pinafore, oh my. I am so disgusted with that phrase, hardly ever, etc. I feel like shooting everyone I hear use it. H.M.S. is getting to be a worse eyesore on the billboards than hop bitters. The telephone company have found it almost impossible to use their wires in the city. The wires are loaded with pinafore. One wire broke over in Beaver Street, and one of Little Buttercup's songs spilled all over the roof. The slack wire curled up into these letters, H.M.S. Oh, it's terrible. Worse than yellow fever. Your friend as ever, Will.
Humor proved a potent potion against the Pinafore plague, including not-so-subtle gallows humor.
At a Colorado lynching, they had a brass band in attendance, which played selections from Pinafore. The prisoner said he was willing to die, and did all he could to help along the preparations. Pinafore has reached Arizona, and the Apaches are striking out for New Mexico. A horse ran away at the railroad depot in Philadelphia and knocked down 17 persons, each one belonging to a different Pinafore company. A choir sang Pinafore in the lunatic asylum at Rochester the other day, and would have sung it for the inmates of Auburn prison, but were prevented on the grounds that cruel and unusual punishment had been abolished.
Pauline Markham arrived in San Francisco in early June to find 3 Pinafores already playing in the city: the Amy Sherwin Company at the Grand Opera House, Emily Melville at the Standard, and the Locke Company at the Bush Street Theater. There is no record of the Markham troupe presenting H.M.S. Pinafore, or anything else, in California. And the next we hear of Pauline, she and her Pinafore Company are on their way to Arizona in October. Meanwhile, Emily Melville and Amy Sherwin continued to play San Francisco and Sacramento. Unlike Alice Oates and Pauline Markham, both Emily Melville and Amy Sherwin were legitimate actresses and singers. Amy Sherwin, the Tasmanian Nightingale, came to San Francisco in 1879 at age 24, making her American debut in May as Violetta in La Traviata. Emily Melville was an original member of the stock company that opened San Francisco's California Theater in 1869. She would continue to perform Gilbert and Sullivan operettas after Pinafore, including the lead role in Patience in 1881. Competing for audiences, Emily and Amy waged a war of words in the Sacramento press, with Miss Sherwin boasting that there is no other Pinafore company, and Emily Melville's booking agent responding,
"In reply to the manager of the only Pinafore troupe in California, I desire to say that the Emily Melville Pinafore troupe is playing to crowded houses, sufficient evidence of its superiority over all others, Amy Sherwin included."
To which Miss Sherwin's shill replied,
"In our opinion, the only well-organized Pinafore company is the Amy Sherwin combination."
Amy Sherwin soon took her Pinafore troupe to Nevada, and by early July, only the Melville Company remained in California, joined by an amateur production. As elsewhere, not all observers were smitten with Pinafore.
A new musical fandango entitled H.M.S. Pinafore has been introduced to San Francisco. It will never take.
Indeed, by early August, the Melville troupe was joined by a juvenile production, and it looked like Pinafore-mania was subsiding. Such, however, was not the case, with the Melville troupe mounting a successful revival later that month, and 2 new professional companies opening at Tivoli Garden and Woodward's Gardens. On September 20th, 1879, the steamship Tokyo sailed through the Golden Gate. On board was former President General Ulysses S. Grant, completing a 2.5-year round-the-world tour with his family.
As soon as the steamship Tokyo was sighted, Alcatraz and Fort Point blazed and trembled with great guns, every human being possessed of the idea of seeing the illustrious man. As the general passed, the crowds along the streets fairly shook the buildings with their cheers.
General Grant's San Francisco visit was punctuated by pinafores, beginning with the Standard Theater's Juvenile Pinafore Company touting the expected attendance of Mrs. General Grant. Emily Melville boasted that General Grant would attend her Pinafore performances at both the California and the Standard Theaters. One commentator remarked,
"As there were no physicians about, it is impossible to give a diagnosis of Grant's symptoms after seeing Pinafore."
Re-energized by General Grant's visit, the Melville Pinafore Company attempted even grander exhibitions, including Pinafore on the Water in Sausalito. The last we'd heard of Pauline Markham She and her Pinafore company were on their way to Arizona, passing through Los Angeles on October 21st. In early November, the reorganized and renamed Haynes Operatic Company presented Pinafore in Tucson, with Pauline Markham as Josephine.
The hall was full, the troupe in excellent trim, the audience appreciative. Miss Pauline Markham as Josephine did herself credit. In some parts of the play, she might be considered a star.
The company next played Tombstone. In the Arizona Territory, after 9 months on the road, Pauline Markham at last found virgin, fertile ground for Pinafore. On Christmas Eve, 1879, the Markham troupe opened in Prescott, Arizona, to much fanfare. A 21st century historian describes the scene.
It was Christmas Eve, 1879, at the Prescott Theater. A rowdy mix of miners, merchants, lawyers, judges, soldiers, saloon keepers, and refined ladies were packed shoulder to shoulder as Fort Whipple's 12th Infantry Band struck up the opening strains of the overture. H.M.S. Pinafore was about to take Prescott by storm, and the audience must have erupted into cheers when the sensational Pauline Markham stepped out on stage as Josephine, the lass who loved a sailor. Prescottonians had never experienced the thrill of Gilbert and Sullivan's sublimely silly operetta and the presence of a renowned burlesque star in their midst.
An 18-year-old woman from San Francisco, Josephine Marcus, enchanted by a performance of Pinafore, had slipped away with the Markham troupe for its Arizona tour. Born in Brooklyn in 1861 to German-Jewish immigrants, she attained fame as the third wife of Wyatt Earp. When D'Oyly Carte's genuine Pinafore opened at Ford's Fifth Avenue Theater on December 1st, New York had been continuously hosting pirated versions of the opera since January. Indeed, reviewers noted no substantial difference between the genuine Pinafore and the best pirated versions, noting only that Sullivan's full orchestration was far superior to the simple piano accompaniment of the imitators. The genuine Pinafore completed a successful 4-week run on December 27th, 1 year and 1 month after the first American production at the Boston Museum. H.M.S. Pinafore belonged to America now. As H.L. Mencken observed on the occasion of Gilbert's death in 1911,
before or since, the American stage has never seen another such success.
Today, 136 years after its London premiere, it's a good bet that someone is in rehearsals right now for the next performance of H.M.S. Pinafore in America.